Welcome to the Ex Good Girl podcast, the place where people pleasers, perfectionists, and overgivers come to unlearn the good girl rules that you thought were making you good, but now you can see are actually just keeping you small. If you've spent your life being unable to say no, putting everyone else's needs and feelings above your own, constantly seeking external approval, or avoiding conflict to make others feel comfortable, if guilt and resentment feel like a constant weight in your life, it is time to learn to knock that shit off. Every episode, we dive into the stories, skills, and strategies that you need to stop shrinking, start speaking up, and to live a life that is authentically and unapologetically yours, while also deepening the connection and vulnerability in the relationships that matter to you. I'm glad you're here. Let's jump in. You heard Crystal Hall's name a couple of weeks back because when I did the episode in response to the video about why women are leaving the church, Crystal was one of the first people that I thought of to kind of help me see it from a lot of different angles. And she's here today because I have so many questions for her about her work. And I think you're going to be really interested because Crystal works inside the church from a feminist space. And that sounds a little oxymoronic to me based on my experience inside of a, very conservative Christian religion, the LDS church. But nonetheless, there's a conversation to be had here. And Crystal, I'm just really grateful that you would give me some of your time and energy this morning. What would you like people to know about you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Sarah, for the invitation to be here today. It's such an honor to have this conversation with you, and I'm so looking forward to diving in. Before we got started, I was sharing with you that it was so fun to go back and review notes and look at old documents. And I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for the invitation. And what got me into this work, and this feels so appropriate for the title of your podcast, is that I was such a good girl. I was such a good girl. And yet I was completely miserable. And I was one of those people who found coaching because I had done almost everything right, and yet I couldn't understand why I was so unhappy. And I grew up in a church tradition called the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA, which on paper is one of the most progressive denominations in the United States. When I was growing up, I saw women be pastors. I saw my mother, who was a Christian education director and then became the minister of programming for the entire church. Like, I saw women in leadership. I saw women with the institutional authority of the church. And I was involved in Lutheran campus ministry when I was in college. And my campus pastor, who was a woman and a lesbian, asked me if I was planning to go to seminary. And I was like, what? And I thought about it for another year. And then I did apply. And I was in a relationship at the time that I was discerning a call to seminary with a guy who was very, what's the best word to say this? He was very firm in telling me that women can't be pastors. And of course, he quoted the Bible at me. And I applied and promptly broke up with him and started the ordination process while I was in seminary, but eventually discerned a call to teach instead of to be ordained as a pastor. And while I was doing my master's in seminary, I had an advisor who was also a woman and a lesbian and a nationally respected preacher in the ELCA. And she kind of looked at me like as only she could look at people. Like, she had this look where she kind of like looks at you in your soul. And she said to me, she's like, so are you planning to do a PhD? And I was like, no, hadn't thought about it. And so like I've had these like very strong women who are leaders in the church in my life who have asked me these moments of pivotal questions that really helped to shape my calling. And I did a PhD in biblical studies, as one does. I'm trained in feminist theory. I landed one of those rare tenure track positions as a professor, and so started teaching at a seminary as a layperson, but with all the institutional credibility of the church. I was a teaching theologian of the church, and I, like so many of the women I work with, was a first. I was the first woman to serve as a New Testament scholar in my institution in that position. And there are so many women who, even in my generation, I'm a millennial, there are still so many women who are serving as firsts in their churches or their institutions. The first woman to be called as a pastor, the first woman to be a professor in a particular field within an institution. And so I had all the credibility except ordination. I worked hard. I fostered community. I served on all the committees. I did all the extra work. And I thought that I had arrived, right? Like I had done all the things, but I was exhausted and resentful and hustling for my worthiness and so confused about why people weren't telling me that it was enough.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I really started trying to figure out, okay, I've done all the things, I have all the credentials, and yet I am very confused about why I still feel overwhelmed and over responsible and exhausted. And in ministry settings, people know the things. Like in ministry settings, people are trained on self care and setting boundaries and prioritizing. And yet, I wasn't doing any of those things consistently. None of my colleagues were doing any of those things consistently. And so, where my coaching practice really fits is trying to solve this problem that I was facing myself of like, how do I know the things? And how could I even justify them theologically? And yet, I'm not doing any of them.
Yeah.
And so, like, really starting to unpack all of that patriarchal programming of that I was socialized in far before I learned anything about feminism, far before I learned anything about the academic study of the Bible. And so, starting to unwind all of those subconscious beliefs that were running in the background of I'm less than, I'm not smart enough, I don't deserve to be an authority, who am I? Like, all of that was what I worked to first unpack in myself. And now I work as a coach with women who are pastors, deacons, lay church professionals, women with some kind of institutional authority within the church. So these are women who know the things and have the credibility, and yet are still struggling with all of the same issues. And so there's a really interesting contradiction between on paper, we should have equality. And yet, why are we acting as if we don't?
That is such an interesting question. And I mean, just the way you describe it, it's like patriarchy just got there first.
Yeah.
Right. And in the early, really formative years when you're really looking around and seeing what women do and get rewarded for, what they do and get punished for, what is my role? What are the rules of these different groups that I belong to? It's just patriarchy was the foundational layer that just kind of got there first.
Mm-hmm.
Which
in
is
so many ways.
Yeah, which is so interesting. So how did your feminist values then begin to emerge or take shape within, was it within that faith context, or was it in a different context and then you brought it to your faith?
Yes, and yes, in the sense that being raised in a tradition that is progressive on paper, being raised in a tradition where women can take on these institutional forms of leadership, can preach and teach and administer the sacraments and do theology and do it in public. There were ways in which I think I was shown that more than I was told that as I was growing up. And it was really only in my own work in seminary that I really started to understand, okay, what are the theological underpinnings of this? What does the Bible have to say about this? But even within my cultural experience of the church, the language of the church is still overwhelmingly male. The Bible is overwhelmingly a patriarchal text. We can get into that. The liturgy is still overwhelmingly dominated by male imagery of God and God's people. And so there's so many ways in which I still had a very patriarchal understanding of who God is, who the church is, what the Bible is, even though there were these glimpses, if you will, of a different way of being. And yeah, it was really only until I was doing work as a master's student and then as a doctoral student that I really started to like unpack this intellectually for myself. But it wasn't until I became a coach that like I could really start to connect theory and practice. It's like, okay, in theory, intellectually, I know that because of feminism, that women and men and people of all genders are equal. But then coaching was the thing that actually helped me to connect the dots to, okay, I know this in theory, but how do I actually solve the problem of the fact that I'm doing massively more housework than my husband is? And like, how do I actually live this out in practice?
It's such an interesting just juggle, because what occurs to me is it just kind of really doesn't matter the context. It doesn't matter if it's a religious context, if it's some other social or cultural group. If patriarchy gets there first, there's always going to be this tension. And especially for those who kind of seek out feminism in particular, to learn about. So many, I think, of the women who listen to this podcast are not going to be, feminist scholars. But they're aware that they don't feel good. They're aware that there is something that seems to be built into the system that is unfair, that makes their life seem smaller, that makes, speaking up harder in whatever context they're in. But because of your background and where you work, like, what would you say to those people who say that there is a fundamental incompatibility between feminism and Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I would say in so many ways is you're right. There is, in that the Christianity, the way it's practiced today, is an overwhelmingly conservative force in society. It is overwhelmingly one of the reasons why there has been so much pushback, both historically and today. I mean, I think we're seeing that in a different form today with the current political situation. That religion is the reason, one of the primary reasons why women have struggled to find equality with men. That religion is an overwhelmingly conservative force. And so I want to acknowledge that up front, that is absolutely true, to say that Christianity and feminism on a lot of levels are not compatible. And I want to speak to that from my perspective as a biblical scholar, because there's different ways that interpretation really gets at this. Like, there are different strategies. One, which just the one that I just offered, is what I would call a resistance reading of the text or the tradition, to say, the text itself is the cause of oppression, or the church tradition itself is the cause of oppression, and we need to problematize it as such, to just name Christianity as not good for women, to name the Bible as not good for women. That is one strategy. And I think there is a role for resisting the tradition and resisting the biblical text. Other options on the table, and it's not one or the other, it's often a combination of several, but two other options I want to offer. One is recovery of the text and the tradition. And this is a way of identifying the texts and traditions that do actually affirm the equality of women and men. And so one way that we can look at recovery, just as an example, is to look at the feminine images of God in the Bible, to look at the way that God is described as a mother bear who is protecting her cubs, or the way that God is described, Jesus is described as um, a mother hen who is gathering his chicks around himself, or we could look at the women in the Bible, right? We could look at Ruth or Esther or Deborah, who's a judge. I mean, she's a military leader. Or we could look at Jael, who like shoved a tent peg through the head of, like we could look at all these different strong women and recover those recover those images, recover those stories. We could talk about like the women who surround Jesus, the women who surround Jesus's disciples, or even in Paul's letters, there's Phoebe the deacon, there's Junia the apostle, there's Mary Magdalene, who's the first preacher of the resurrection. Like there are all of these women who, because historically the Bible has been interpreted by men, these are stories that are largely marginalized, and stories that are largely ignored, because for the vast majority of biblical interpretation, it's been white, cishet, highly educated European men with German accents who have been interpreting the Bible. And so recovery, I think, is another option here. One other option I want to offer in terms of both the text and the tradition is reading against the grain. So rereading, which is, so we have resistance, recovery, and then rereading is the third and final one I'll offer, which is acknowledging the dominant narrative within the text, like acknowledging the dominant narrative is one of patriarchy, is one that centers the experience of men, that centers the authority of men, that it's a book that, or a library of books really, that was composed, edited, which books made it in and which ones didn't. All of that gets decided by men. It is the product of men. And yet, even with that, you have these edges around the text where you have these voices of oppressed women, you have these voices of oppressed people, of sexual minorities, as we would use that language today. The Ethiopian eunuch, I think, is a great example of that. So you have all of these stories that happen, like these characters around the edges of the text. And they often serve to interpret the larger tradition. Like, for example, the Syrophoenician woman in Mark who sasses back to Jesus, right? Like these are characters that are on the edges of the text, but are nevertheless interpreting the larger tradition. And historically, we have the same thing. Like women have never been credentialed to interpret the Bible, but women have been interpreting the Bible since there was one. They haven't done it in a credentialed way. They haven't done it with the authority of the institutional church until the 20th century, but there have always been women interpreters, and they've always been on the margins of the tradition. And so there are ways I would offer that recovery and rereading can be ways of finding the intersections between Christianity and feminism. But I think there is also a real role for resistance here to say, like, yes, this is a deeply problematic text. This is a deeply problematic tradition. And I would offer there's no one right or wrong answer there, but there are these different options for how to engage with both the Bible and what I would call church tradition writ large.
I want to come back to your comment about Christianity just being an overwhelmingly conservative force in our world in just a second. But as you have engaged in, resistance, recovery, and rereading, what kind of experience did you have within the church personally?
Yeah. Oh gosh. How long do we have? I'll give you a couple small examples. So one is when I was installed as a teaching theologian of the church, there's a what's called a ritual of installation. And so, all the trappings, right, of the church, the academic robes, all the things. And so there's a liturgy that's associated with this, like a written text, and The chaplain of the chapel, the chapel leader, the chapel organizer, he sent me the liturgy. He said, "Look this over. Let me know if you have any edits." And because it was my service, that I'm the one being installed, and so completely naively sent him back several edits to this liturgy. And there's so in the liturgical tradition, which comes from biblical tradition, there's a way of naming God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so this is language that obviously is patriarchal. It's male. It's describing God as Father and Son, and Holy Spirit. That gets a little more tricky, but it's overwhelmingly male imagery. And so, what I completely naively did was I suggested not feminine language for God, which is biblically appropriate, but I suggested gender neutral language for God. So, I had suggested, okay, instead of using Father, Son, Holy Spirit, why don't we use Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, which is neutral language. I was like, I'm not going to, theoretically, I could have gone with the feminine language, right? Because on paper, our church affirms that.
Yeah.
Right? On paper. But the pushback and the controversy of, the person who was organizing the service emailed me back and said, "We can't do that." And I'm like, "Wait, what do you mean we can't do that?" Like, no, we have to use Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Why? And so it just became this whole back and forth. And where we finally came to agreement was, okay, we'll just use both. We're going to use Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer. And I was like, okay, compromise. And this is just such a tiny example, but I think it's a really interesting is not the right word, but it's a really telling one about some of these tensions still being very alive and well about how do we talk about God? How do we talk about God's people? What imagery is considered authoritative or appropriate, quote unquote, and which imagery and language is not? And there were so many ways. I'll give you a larger example where there were so many ways, like as I deepened into my own understanding of my social programming, as I learned how to say no more and more, as I became unavailable for being indispensable more and more. Like I really came to a crux or a turning point in my own experience of the institutional church where I thought to myself, I kind of had this experience where I was like looking out at the next 30 years of my life. And I was thinking to myself, I could keep doing what I'm doing and I could be very good at it. I could keep doing what I'm doing as a seminary professor for the rest of my career and fight the good fight about, inclusive and expansive language for God and feminist interpretation of the Bible and supporting women in ministry as their seminary students, right? Like I could do that and be really excellent at it. And I realized, I'm like, I don't know if I can do that and
Mm.
live in integrity with my calling. Because I was no longer willing to ignore my body, which is a deeply feminist thing, right? To center the experience of women's bodies, women's experience, women's intuition. My body was telling me, this is not right. This is not for you. You keep chafing against this institutional restriction and the ways in which you as a woman are being put in boxes over and over and over again. And it was at that point that I decided to leave, which was insane at the time, right? Like to leave the institutional authority, to leave the credibility of that behind, to leave the power, frankly, that comes with that, and to say thanks but no thanks. And I left my position in order to really give my coaching practice the time and attention that it deserved because I was willing to listen to my intuition, which was telling me over and over and over again, what you're doing is not working for you. And yet when I was willing to like step out into the work that has no institutional approval, right? That became I felt like I was stepping into this like bigger, wider version of myself that I never could have experienced within the confines of the institution. And I think that's really the one of the lessons I continue to learn is the importance of being willing to trust my body when I'm someone who's deeply trained to stay in my head, and just how important that is as a woman, because we're taught to disconnect from our bodies, and yet they have incredible wisdom to share with us.
What you're speaking to, I think, is the place where a lot of women find themselves, women of faith who are in congregations, longing for that bigger, wider versions of themselves. They long to see their experiences reflected in the not just the biblical text, but the weekly lessons and sermons. And there's that stuckness that they feel kind of between faith and that bigger, wider version. Sometimes they're actually experiencing harm sitting in the pews week after week. And what would you say to women who feel that stuckness between longing for the bigger, wider version and still wanting to be a woman of faith?
Mm-hmm. The first thing that comes to mind is find your people, because like this is work that cannot be done alone. This is work that I would offer necessitates community. And in order to reconnect with my faith, I had to go outside of my faith to the coaching community. And like in the coaching community, I found so many people who were wrestling with the same questions that I was, but in completely secular language, in language that didn't resonate with my church community or seemed strange to my church community. And so there was something that was really important for me about finding those people who were speaking a different language, if you will. But I think there's also an importance of finding those people within your tradition, because, just like the Bible doesn't speak with one voice, the tradition does not speak with one voice. And institutions are heterogeneous in the sense that there are, even within the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, my denomination, there are people who are deeply conservative and there are people who are deeply progressive. And if you look for your people, you will find them. Like if you look for the people who are trying to connect, what does my faith have to say with my belief in the equality of women and men and people of all genders? Like there are people within your church that are asking those same questions. It may not be within your immediate congregation, but there are certainly people within your tradition that if you look for them, you will find them. And I think there's also a value sometimes of taking those steps outside of the church to find your people elsewhere as well. And it's not an either or, right? I mean, I still am deeply connected with people within the church, although I no longer hold the institutional authority of the church. And so for me, it's still a tradition that has meaning and value, but I have a very different relationship to it now. And I think there's also a role here for, and I know you've talked about this on your podcast, so many times, Sarah, about like the role of grieving what has been lost. Because there is, for me, I have in my own experience felt a profound sense of grief that comes from betrayal, where here it's like I was passed on this tradition, and this tradition that was given to me was deeply problematic. And in so many ways, deeply harmful to me. And for me, there is grief in that it is now my responsibility to mourn what I have lost, mourn the opportunities of, my faith experience could have been so much different had I had different tools for understanding what was passed on to me. And I mean, and in some ways, I think it's also really important for people to recognize how new this conversation is within the church, that feminism is only a term that developed in the 19th century. And within the church, like it's a conversation we really haven't been having for all that long. I mean, women's ordination in mainline Protestant traditions really only doesn't, it really only starts happening in the mid 20th century. So, I mean, I met the first woman in person who was ordained in the ELCA. I mean, she's quite a bit older than I am, but like she's still alive, right? It's like I can see and touch the first woman who was ordained in my tradition. I mean, that's how recent these
Yeah.
conversations are. And yet these conversations are ancient at the same time. It's like there were women with authority in the earliest church. So it's a very old and yet a very new conversation all at the same time. But I think there is a role of like grieving the fact that I didn't know who Junia the apostle was until I went to grad school. It's like every girl in church should know who Junia the apostle is, right? Like that should be something that should be as a girl handed on to me. That is a part of that is my heritage and my birthright to know that story. And yet I didn't. And so there is grief in that. And I think it's so important to name and acknowledge that.
There is so much grief there. And I think this kind of circles back, as I hoped we would, to just this overwhelmingly conservative force that the Christian church as a whole is, because that was a deep part of my own grief, that the Jesus that I had been taught to believe in, who centered the marginalized, who touched lepers and treated women, the poor, the disabled, and the socially excluded as not just touchable, right, working with them, but as worthy of honor and healing and deep presence with them. All the ways that he challenged those who were really stuck in hierarchies and devoted to making money and accumulating power, like that Jesus disappeared for me. It could be argued that my own religious denomination, Mormonism, the LDS Church, moved in a very conservative religion, consolidating power behind, Donald Trump and candidates who seemed to want the very opposite things. Jesus is refusing violence as a way to get what you want. He is challenging all of the norms of the time. And then today, it's almost like we have this gentle, passive Jesus that just has a lamb in his lap and is just petting it, just totally okay with everything that is going on. And so I think that for me is at the heart of the grief that I feel, that the Jesus that I grew to deeply love and deeply believe in was cast aside when it was politically, expedient to do so. So what are some of the, if this isn't too personal a question, and if it is, we can just strike it, but what are some of the things in particular that you have had to grieve?
That's such an interesting question. Yeah, what's coming to mind is the sense of my worth, my approval being, I've been taught all my life that my worth and my approval come from the affirmation of others, the work that I do for others, the over functioning I do for others, the way I keep other people happy. And I was really freaking good at that, like really good at that within the institutional church. Like I learned an institution and then I figured out all the ways to be helpful. And what's so painful to me and what I think I grieve about that is that I really wish that someone had taken me aside and said, "Hey girl, all this stuff that you're doing for other people to keep them happy, you think that that's keeping you safe because you think that when push comes to shove, these people are going to take care of you." What was deeply painful for me was realizing those people are not going to take care of you and the adults are not coming. There were
Yeah.
so many moments in which, being in this seminary, serving on these committees, sitting in board meetings, I'm thinking to myself, like, where are the adults? Where are the adults coming? Because I don't see, like, I was still looking for that authority outside of myself. And I grieve that I didn't learn that sooner.
Mm.
Like, I grieve that I didn't learn how to trust my gut, trust my body, trust my own voice, my innate sense of this is who I am and this is what I'm called to be, and being willing to be misunderstood, being willing to disappoint people. Like, I grieve that I didn't learn that sooner, because I spent a lot of time keeping a lot of people happy and like propping a lot of people up. Like, I helped the institution continue its dysfunction in so many ways. And it, I grieve that for the students that I taught. I grieve that for the pastors that I trained, but I grieve that for myself too, that like this was just it was such a deeply missed opportunity. Because I never was taught how to trust myself. And frankly, like, the system relies on people being unwilling to trust themselves. Like, the system relies on you being an obedient good girl, and even at that level, and being towing the line and doing what you're told. And even with all the authority I had, like, I still was expected to toe the line. And I yeah, I really wish I had learned to trust my gut a lot sooner than I did.
That's such a big one. I think for so many women who are living with the tension between, feeling like they need to continue in a specific fill in the blank, religious tradition, employment situation, relationship, but are experiencing the tension of like something is off, something is not right, something doesn't feel good here. Yeah, I can really identify with that. And I think you also named another source of my own grief, which is realizing that the institution will always protect itself.
Yes.
And that
Yes.
my questions, my pain, my experience of hurt and sorrow doesn't matter in relation to the institution protecting itself.
Yeah. That the institution, I mean, this is an awful metaphor, but like, the institution eats people.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the institution is not designed with humanity in mind. Like, the institution is designed, as you said, to perpetuate itself. And so for the church, there's an awful tension between, wait, but Jesus said, dot, 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 and then the institutional reality of the church.
Right. Yes.
Which is very different.
Yes.
And so, like, that tension is, I think, all the more acute within religious spaces, because you're trained in these deeply held beliefs about who Jesus is, where he is within society, the call to serve the marginalized, the call to, listen to the voices of the oppressed. There's that. And then there's you figuring out how to make that happen in a board meeting and realizing just how impossible that's going to be. And that tension between what we're called to and the institutions that we've built, those are two radically different things.
And not just that you will be misunderstood in the board meeting, but you might be punished.
Oh, absolutely.
You might have your authority reduced or stripped, or in like more of my, Mormon background, you will lose access to the very things that the sacrament, the very things that we say we need to be partaking of on a weekly basis for our salvation to be what we want it to be. It's just such an interesting intersection of the things that we experience in this life because of our faith, but what we also hope for in the next life, if that's part of what your religious tradition believes, and to have all of that kind of always hanging in the balance of your behavior.
Yes. Yeah, because if you're not a good girl.
That's right.
Can I give you like a tiny example of that?
Please, I would love to hear it.
So when I was a seminary professor, I served as a representative to the board of trustees, as a representative of the faculty. And so there were several moments where, because of the dynamics of the institution at the time, like I was, as a representative of my colleagues, speaking against the institution, saying the institution is doing this, this is not supporting faculty, or the institution is doing this, it's not supporting our students. Or, and there were a number of times when, you know, especially as a young woman, that this felt dangerous. Like this felt like a big risk. It felt scary in my body. And when I was up for my first review, that when I was up for my first promotion, that was evaluated by the same board that I had been speaking up against. I mean, the board was basically rubber stamping what the faculty had already approved, but they had final authority. And so they already knew me as a bit of a troublemaker, because I spoke out against the institution. And I I remember after the vote, because I wasn't present for the vote, my dean called me and he congratulated me on being approved for this promotion. But he said, now, and he got this like very kind of fatherly tone in his voice. He said, so this wasn't me. I want you to know that this wasn't me. But I want you to know that during the discussion about whether to approve you or not, there were serious concerns that were expressed about whether you are respectful enough to be continuing at this institution, right? And so there was never any question about whether I was going to be promoted. But it was this like zinger there at the end of, you better be, you better tone it down a little bit, because if you don't, look out, was like basically the subtext of what my dean was saying. And it's, you don't feel that like that wasn't public, right? I mean, I think that was very intentionally a private, not recorded, not documented conversation. I think that was very intentional on everybody's part. But this sort of like finger wagging, like, you better be good, you're causing too much trouble, right? Like I felt that viscerally in my body, like the fear and the shame and the I was like, oh, I'm bumping up against the authority here, and my body's letting me know that this is scary and dangerous. Obviously it's not, right? I mean, I'm not on a physical level, but like there are these very real ways in which my body was letting me know some things.
Yeah.
About what was happening in that conversation. And it's just, but if I had been a man saying the exact same things in the exact same tone, that conversation would not have happened. For sure. No one would have been telling me to be more respectful.
It's such coded language, right? It is such, it's punishment language for a woman who doesn't bow down, who is acting with less appeasement than we want to see. Like we really want you to be less clear, less direct, less angry, less of yourself.
Just
less. Yeah. So what gives you hope now in this intersection of like feminism and faith?
I love this question. What gives me hope is the ways or the opportunities to explore how both the Bible and the tradition writ large are always pointing us to the margins. And the way that I think, and when I say we, I mean here very broad strokes. The way people are traditionally in the United States enculturated into the Bible is to read themselves at the center of the story. That Jesus is at the center of the story and Christianity is at the center of the story. And part of my training as a biblical scholar was to understand the ways in which the Bible and the Jesus movement, and I use that language deliberately, the ways in which they were not at the center of the story. Because who's at the center of the story in the first century of the Common Era in the Mediterranean basin when Jesus is alive is the Roman Empire. Like the Roman Empire is at the center of the story. And Jesus is operating in an occupied backwater territory that has been conquered by the Roman Empire. And so if we want to look at the gender of this, I mean, women, conquered nations are personified as women within Roman iconography. That Judea is personified as this mourning woman under a palm tree on Roman coins. Like, this is the way that the center perceives Jesus and Jesus's people. They don't see him as a man, like they see him as a feminized member of a conquered nation. He's not at the center of the story. His people are not at the center of the story.
That's so amazing. It's so interesting, so important. Yeah.
And so to read him at the center of the story is to read him deeply out of context. I mean, if we look at the history of this text, this is a text that was written about a marginalized man within a marginalized society that has been occupied and conquered, eviscerated off the face of the planet. But we're not trained to read it that way without the benefit of history and scholarship. And so what gives me hope is the idea that more and more people could learn to read from that perspective. That there's so much more that the text has to offer us when we decenter the story. When we see that Jesus in his time was not at the center. And so if Jesus was not at the center, I think that invites us to rethink, okay, if we in the United States in largely privileged identities read ourselves at the center of the story, how do we look to the margins? Like, how do we actually look to people who are being persecuted today, immigrants, trans people, women? Like, how do we look to the margins of our society today? Because that's where Jesus was. Like, that's what gives me hope, is being able to make more and more of that connection with and for people, because it is that's a largely marginal interpretation of the text. Like, the vast majority of biblical scholars in this country will not read it that way. But I think there is a value in continuing to do so. So that's what gives me hope.
Me too. That's because that's the Jesus that I long for. You know, that the Jesus who rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, not a war horse, right? Who is constantly reaching for those on the margins to bless and to serve them and to bring them into equity. What does let me see, how do I want to ask this? If there is like a feminist spiritual community, what is your imagination tell you that could be like? What does it value? I mean, we've talked a little, about marginalizations, but what does a feminist like reimagining of a spiritual community look like to you?
Yeah, we haven't talked about this explicitly yet, but I think there is, and I think there's a value here in talking about intersectionality and the work of Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw and the ways in which feminism really benefits from looking at issues not just in terms of gender, but in terms of other forms of marginalization, race, class, sexual orientation, age, disability, etc. Pick your marginalized identity, insert here. And because so much, I mean, really one of the sins of feminism has been the ways in which white women have excluded
That's
women
right.
of color, the ways in which white women have excluded um, women of all sorts of marginalized identities. And for me, like what a feminist community looks like is centering the voices of women of color, centering the voices of women who have been marginalized, whether that's because of sexual orientation or class or language. And with those voices at the center, gathering around the word, like gathering around scripture, gathering around the tradition, and reinterpreting on the basis of centering those stories and voices and perspectives and knowledges that have been most marginalized. Centering the voices of Indigenous women, like these are, I think these are the margins that we need to call to the center. And it's not my role to call that, right? Like as a white woman, like that's not my place. Um, so yeah, I mean that's what it looks like to me. I mean, and there's certainly, I mean, the work of womanism, which centers the experience of Black women, the uh, Mujerista theology, which centers the experience of Latino women. I mean, these are branches within the theological tradition that are absolutely worthy of study, and there are institutions being built around them. I mean, I think of the Katie Cannon Center for Womanist Leadership. I mean, that these are forces within the church that are calling to that margin and calling for the margin to be brought back to the center. I mean, these places do exist within the church. They're not mainstream by any stretch of the imagination, but they do exist, and they often look pretty, offbeat in so many ways, but they are there. I mean, and there's certainly resources. I mean, I think the work of Dr. Will Gaffney, who is a womanist biblical scholar, has gathered a collection. I'm not going to get the title exactly right. I will get the title because it's important to get the exact title right here. It's a book where she's gathered a lectionary, a cycle of readings that center on the experiences of women. So the centering texts like A Women's Lectionary for the Whole Church by Dr. Will Gaffney, like these are the sorts of resources that belong at the center that have been historically excluded.
I have loved everything about this conversation because that's the community that I want to be a part of, right? That's the type of thing that pulls my soul back to, if not faith specifically, for sure spirituality, and just this belief in something bigger than me, and something bigger than us. And so I'm just so grateful for your insight and for what you've added to this conversation. Is there anything that we didn't get to that you really wanted to make sure you added to the conversation?
I think the last thing I want to say is thank you. I mean, thank you for your work. Thank you for creating this kind of space, because as I've been listening to these episodes that have been coming out recently about faith and about, being within faith, leaving faith, criticism of faith, reclaiming of faith, like all these different elements and dimensions of this conversation are just so vital, especially in this moment when religion is something that's being deeply contested in US culture. And there are ways in which I would offer things that are very dangerous to the experience of women and people of other marginalized identities are being deeply threatened. And so being willing to continue to speak out on these issues, to explore these issues with nuance and sophistication is vitally important for these times. And so I want to thank you, Sarah, for continuing to stand in the breach, if you will, and have these important conversations.
Well, thank you for being here today. I think we want the same thing. We want women to feel empowered to have whatever experience they want to be having that feels good and safe in their bodies, that speaks to their divinity, the beauty of the individuality of them, and allows them to express that in the world in ways that feel like, just really good. Most often, the word that women say to me in terms, when I ask them what it is that they want to be feeling, it's authentic. And I know that we kind of use that word a lot, but I don't know of a better word that really describes the alignment that is available in that, bigger, wider image that you and I have both found by leaving some of the traditional church experience that we grew up with and finding our own space, creating that own space. And it is that act of creation, I think, that is at the very center of what it is to believe in a faith tradition, because all of this began with what we believe is, an incredible act of creation, and just focusing on our ability to be co-creators with whatever we believe to be true of whatever kind of life we want to be having, I think is my deepest wish. So thank you for being in that wish with me today.
I love that.
Hey, thanks for listening. If this podcast has been helpful to you, I would really appreciate it if you would give me a 5-star rating in whatever platform you listen to your podcast. And if you go to my website, sarahfisk.coach, you can sign up there to receive my emails. Right now, I'm taking private one-to-one clients who want my help speeding up this work in their own lives. I really hope to provide a lot of free information on my website and in my podcast for people to do this work on their own. But if you're interested in having a coach like me to help you implement these things faster, to find the blind spots and obstacles that you're not aware of, go to my website and sign up for a consult. That's a time when you and I can get on Zoom and talk about the particulars of your situation, and I can show you how I could be helpful. The second thing you can do on my website is sign up for a freebie that I have called Difficult Conversations. Having a conversation that seems like it's going to be hard or difficult is one of the things that people pleasers struggle with. And so I've created a whole guide for you to be able to do that with some more confidence. That will also get you signed up for information about my group program, Stop People Pleasing. It's a group coaching program where you join a community of women just like you who are struggling to overcome perfectionating and people pleasing, and we do it together in a group. It's a really amazing opportunity to not just learn from your own experience, but just to see how similar you are to so many other women out there. The healing and the challenging and the laughing and the growth that happens in that beautiful community of women is really amazing. And if it's interesting to you, I would love for you to know about it.